Live now. So we should be live now.
Okay.
There is a delay. Hi, everyone.
Hello, all.
So if you've never seen... Oh, good. If you've never seen... I need to take care of something real quickly, actually. Mike, why don't you tell them how bad I am at this stuff?
Okay. The best laid plans of scheduling and intentionality are often led astray by time. Seems like a good quote to start us off. Oh, also, let's talk about how much we dislike the mood.
Yeah, just get that out there.
Yeah, it's not a good pedal. People are saying hello in the chat. Hello, 8-Tracks and Cheryl.
Sorry, I have a cat thing, and you may hear my cat. She's old and just does cat stuff.
So they do best.
So the idea behind this live stream, I'm just going to jump into it because as some people have pointed out, the prospectus for this is pretty large. The idea behind the live stream is to just basically do a quick overview of the modules, and this will be pretty basic stuff. With these live streams, I ideally want them to focus more on like patching a specific idea, but November has been sort of like everyone's lived in 2020 with the rest of us, but November has been my most 2020 month, and I just don't have the attention span, the creativity to really put in the type of work I'd like to do for something a little bit more patching oriented. But I also thought about when I was looking at ZOIA way back in 2019 when none of us knew this was coming. Ben Jordan put out a video I'm sure a lot of you have seen where he describes the ZOIA, and he put that out like on the eve of its release. So it came out before any of us had it in hand. And one of the things that he did a lot of things in that video. If you haven't seen it, it's worth checking out. Ben Jordan's a genius. A lot of you I know have enjoyed his patches. His music's great, all that stuff. Go find Ben Jordan. Watch him instead of this. But at the very end of that video, he just like really briefly ran through all the modules in ZOIA. Like, he just names them for the most part, but at a few points he stopped and talked about what they did. And I found that useful, just as sort of an overview of everything that's in ZOIA. And there are other resources for this. Obviously, there's the module index. There's the I was going to try and do some screen sharing, but I'm not going to do that because the more technical stuff we get into, the more I'll get distracted. But there's the ZOIA webpage on empresseffects.com, which just has a list of all the modules. There's also, and I'm going to switch from us looking at me to us looking at ZOIA now. Once I do that right here. We're going to look at ZOIA now. And there's lots of resources on here. Obviously, when you start placing modules, you have a full list of the modules in here. I wanted to talk about some features that people don't use a lot. So there's the help feature. Which if you press on it, it gives a brief description of the module. I'm not sure how well this is coming through. got a wide angle lens thing going on here. It's not ideal. I just didn't have time to research getting a better webcam before we began. But you press shift in this little, speech bubble, and it gives you an overview of what the module that has been selected does. There is also, for modules that generate CV.
Hey, Christopher, could you move your ZOIA over to 2 inches to the right?
Is that better?
There you go.
Okay.
That looks good.
If you have a module that produces CV, I'm just going to put down sine wave LFO, right? We can look at the numerical output of that, and we see on the number line this little indicator going back and forth, but we can also visualize that using shift, and I call this inspect or view, or I forget what it's called in the manual. You get an oscilloscope, which can be really useful if you're trying to diagnose why something isn't working the way you expected, because you can look at the output of any series of control voltage situations. So there are a lot of resources for this already, and I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here. I was just talking with someone the other day, though, about how sometimes it's valuable to hear things that you can read, and to see things that you can hear. And there are a lot of different ways that we, not just learn information, but retain it too. So maybe for some of you, my wonderful dulcet tones, which I know is really the draw for everyone here, will help some part of a module stick in your head when you're thinking what do I need here? And I'm gonna use a couple of resources. I'll just run those down. I'm gonna wait until we get to the module, but I have an expression pedal set up. Let me see if this is okay. Good. My Cport is set to accept expression pedal. And then I have some loops. If when we get to audio modules, I'm not as confident that we would get to those as I thought. And if we don't, I'll do another video in a week or two, and supplement with the audio modules. But I'm hoping we can zoom through the interface modules, because they're pretty self-explanatory, except for the parts that need a lot of explanation. If you don't know what MIDI does, you're not going to learn it here. There are a lot of other places to figure that out, but I can talk about what MIDI module ZOIA has and that sort of thing. But I'm going to start jumping into the interface modules. And as a broad category, the interface modules do two things. They help ZOIA interface with the rest of the world, and they have some features that allow you to interface with ZOIA through the grid pad. So there's the audio input and audio output. These are your ins and outs to the world. If you have a patch that you're producing sound with, and not every patch produces sound, you're going to need these. I'm not going to go through every iteration of left and right output, but I will point out a very useful feature on the audio output module, which is a gain control. This is useful because it provides sort of a global gain, a global volume for that patch. And that can be all sorts of useful if you're trying to match levels and that sort of thing. Hold on. I'm getting a phone call.
Would it be a live stream without a phone call?
Good old spam risk.
You got to mute it. There's an option to mute calls from unknown numbers.
Yeah, I was using that. Without going too much into my personal life, I need to be able to accept calls from unknown numbers at the moment. Like I said, November and early December have been a weird time in my life. But that's the input and output modules. I think everyone's pretty clear on those. Let me move into MIDI notes in, and I'm not going to do this for every MIDI module, but one of the things that I think confuses people a lot when they're first introduced to ZOIA is that ZOIA handles MIDI in 3 different ways. There is a global level that handles program changes and bypass, and that is something that you set in the configuration menu. There's also a MIDI learn function that operates through the starred parameter menu, and I think Lupop covers that pretty well in his video about ZOIA, if you want a resource for that. And then finally, within a patch, at the level of the module, there is a third place where you set MIDI channels, and this is for what a lot of the MIDI usages you'll use are. So, you know, there are quite a few options for the MIDI note in module in particular that I think people don't necessarily notice, but also if you're downloading a patch off of patch storage, this is if someone says it's on MIDI channel whatever, and please people, when you upload patches to patch storage, tell me what MIDI channel it uses. This is where you would change that if you wanted to in the MIDI note in. But then we have an option of up to 8 outputs, and I'm going to talk about the outputs in a second. There are a bunch of different priorities, and they're all variations on how ZOIA figures out which, you know, if you have a note with, or a patch with 4 notes in and you play 5 notes on your MIDI controller, you know, how does it figure out which one to keep and which one to discard? Greedy is a unison mode. I'm not sure, it's not super well explained in the module index, but again, if we have our 4-note in module, what'll happen under greedy is if I'm pressing down on one key, that key information will be sent to all 4 of the voices of the synth. If I press down on 2 keys, those voices will be distributed to 2 voices each. Those notes will be distributed to 2 voices each. 3, one of the voices will have a stacked oscillator section, and 4, it'll go back to 4-note polyphony, and then 5, it'll deal with the priority. Velocity I'm going to talk about in a second. This is a part that I think not a lot of people recognize. You can set the range for MIDI notes in. So you could have a patch with 2 very different voices where bass notes were played below a certain note and then a plucked sound was played above it. This is also useful if you have, say, a controller with pads, right, that are assigned to specific notes. You can define how information coming in from those specific pads is interpreted in ZOIA. And then there's a trigger pulse. And I'm just going to walk through these MIDI notes in. The note out is where the pitch information comes from. Gate is when you're pressing down on that key or when your sequencer has a note that's being played. Velocity is the strength with which you strike something, and this is a really useful tool for adding dynamics to a patch. And then the trigger can be used alongside the gate to trigger events that happen when you press down on a key. So you could advance a sequence, for instance. Okay. I'm going to move through the next set pretty quickly. MIDI pitch bend. allows you to use a MIDI pitch bend controller on a keyboard, so you can move pitches up and down. That needs to be routed to an oscillator, but because it needs to be routed, it could also be assigned to something else. So keep in mind that the MIDI implementation in ZOIA is robust, but it's also specific or non-specified. So you can do a lot of things with ZOIA that you couldn't do with other devices because of that, but it also means that you have to set those things up for yourself. So MIDI pitch bend is not something that ZOIA automatically knows means adjust the pitch of an oscillator. You have to tell it that. CC in and CC out, these are for sending controller change messages. Again, if you want to pick a channel, that's in the menu for those things. And that would be used for assigning a knob on your controller. The mod wheel is maybe a common example to control a parameter within a patch, but there are other examples. There are some things that can generate MIDI LFOs, and you could use a CC in to attach those to ZOIA. And likewise, you can generate LFOs within ZOIA and send them out via a CC out. MIDI pressure is also known as aftertouch. And the really nice thing about this is, again, we have MIDI channel assignments, so you can set up aftertouch on different channels if you have a controller that does MPE, which I'm going to screw up on, multi MIDI polyphonic expression, MPE. Someone can correct that in the chat. But you can have different devices or different interface elements going to different channels, which gives you a lot of flexibility in setting up a patch. Clock in, we have a few options here. I'm going to set them all and talk about the outputs in a second. There's a beat modifier. I'm using firmware 1.13, and there are a lot of changes to clocking in general in 1.13. But one of them is that you can scroll through a couple of basic beat modifiers, and what these are essentially clock dividers that live inside of the MIDI clock. So you could use those in place of a clock divider and probably get a maybe a clock divider has to calculate beat, whereas this would just sort of I think react a lot faster. And I don't have any clock coming in right now. And then I did that. So the clock, the quarter out, is sort of the normal beat that it's used to. If you press on the clock out, generally you'll see like really fast lights going on, and that's because what that is the actual clock output, which in most cases is something like 24 parts per quarter note. So it's moving 25 times faster than the quarter output. And I don't actually know why we have access to that, but there's probably someone who can use it for something. The reset out will send out a trigger after a sequence has been paused from an external sequencer, and the running output sends out it turns on and off. It goes high or low, and you can use that to open a switch or something like that when it receives a play command externally. And that is the MIDI clock. Again, that's something that we could spend a lot of time on, but we're not going to. You may notice that there's a PC out or program change out, but not a program change in, as I discussed. Before, program changes are handled at a global level in the configuration menu. But you can send program changes from ZOIA out to multiple devices on multiple channels all at once if you want. Again, because we can set the MIDI channel to that specific device. MIDI note out. So this is something that confuses people, or it's a question I have to answer a lot. I won't say it confuses people. It's just something that maybe is not intuitive or obvious. When you want to send polyphonic information out of ZOIA, you have to use multiple iterations of the MIDI note output. It doesn't have the same sort of selector for notes out, and that's because, like ZOIA, at the receiving end, based on the priority and that sort of thing, different things will be given priority based on when they come in. So you send all of that information at once, or almost at once, and at the receiving end, the expectation is that a module will process that according to its protocols. So just something to keep in mind. You can send velocity again, and if you wanted to, send other things in accordance, you could use CC modules. We have a clock out, and you can select a tap input, or you can set a CV value. Most people will use a tap, I suspect. And again, we have a run out, or run in would be, your on message. And the reset, again, would work the same way that these things work when they're received by ZOIA at the clock in. There's also a position thing. I don't actually really know anything about MIDI song position. I know that I don't use it. So if you're looking for information on that, you're going to have to look elsewhere. Stompswitch controls these stomp switches. I'll also point out that if you scroll over, it also can be set for an external stomp switch that comes in through the control port. And if you're using the control port in that manner, you would go to the config menu. And then, so you can set it to normally 0 or normally 1. This really doesn't matter with a latching switch because it will oscillate between 0 and 1, or 0 and 1. And I guess if you really wanted it the first time you used it to be at 0 or 1, but you can save latching position. So if you save a patch when the latching stomp switch is set to 1, it'll be 1 the next time you load it. But with momentary, this can matter. If you want something to be on until you press a switch, particularly when a patch loads, there's some examples that involve some peculiarities of the sequencer, where this is pretty useful, but there are other examples too where you just want to only disrupt a signal when you press the stomp switch. So that's a way to use that. Pixels are pretty lights. They can accept audio too, which is pretty cool. I rarely have ever had the CPU headroom for that. The connection is much more expensive than a CV connection to a Pixel, and in general, if you're looking at ZOIA, audio connections cost more CPU headroom than control voltage connections do. And that's because they have to process more information. The sampling rates are different for the two. But it can be set to audio, so you could have lights change color based on like the intensity of how hard you play, or when you're delay line was repeating notes or something like that. But I mostly use them for CV, and you can set them to all sorts of pretty colors. And then we're going to get to one of my favorites, which is the UI button, which is a module that I ignored for, like, I don't know, the first year I had ZOIA, but it can do a lot of things. For one, as opposed to the push button, its output and input, well, it has an input, so you can, if I press this, right, I can see it light up when I press. I think that's coming through in the camera. It has this output. You can make that output latching using a flip-flop. But it can also, depending on what is selected, the intensity of this connection change to different colors. So I like using these a lot with, like, a sequencer or switch or something like that, where I'm changing where something is going, and I'll have that change reflected in the color of a UI button. They're also really good for creating radio buttons, again, because they can light up. So you could have 3 in a row and have an output of a switch go to whichever one was lit up and change color. So UI buttons are super fantastic for all sorts of UI uses. Push buttons, again, they operate essentially like stomp switches, with the same thing to maybe keep in mind with the normally condition. They're really useful too for setting up different signal paths on your front page. The keyboard module is a weird one. It's in a lot of ways an outlier from the rest of the interface modules. So you can set different notes, and those notes will come out as CV. So you could use it, for instance, to set different options, right? And because it's monophonic, which is something that perturbs a lot of people, it also means it functions like a set of radio buttons. You know, it can only play D4, but that also means it can only produce the CV value associated with D4. So if we, you know, made these A5 or A0, A5, and A1, we could use them to control, say, a switch, right? A 3-channel switch. Those are the values you would use to select between different channels. It has a gate output and a trigger output. It also can be an input, which is strange. And there are really probably like a lot of cool ways to use, right? So you can set up a bunch of LFOs, for instance, and select between them that way. So there are a lot of different ways to use the keyboard module. I think it's only really become useful since 1.13 added the performance mode. So you can make those connections. The problem with things that can be connected to and form their own connections, stuff like that, you would use in UI, is that it's really easy to go like, oh, I'm just adjusting this value, and then I touch something else, and all of a sudden they're buddies, or not buddies, who knows. But the keyboard module is weird and cool, and there are probably a lot of uses for it that I haven't yet discovered, because of its weirdness and coolness. No. And then the last two have to do with how the Cport reacts. And again, you have to correlate what you do here with what you have selected in the configuration menu. So right now, I'm going to actually add this. I want to add it down here because I have an expression pedal hooked up that I'll use in some other instances if I want to change a value pretty quickly. And you can also, this uses, if you're using the CV in, this is the CV in, and then you can have a separate output for CV out. And I'll repeat this for like the 50,000th time. ZOIA has one channel of incoming CV and one channel of outgoing CV. Incoming CV comes in on the ring of a TRS cable, and outgoing CV goes out. I'm sorry, incoming CV comes in on the tip of a TRS cable, and outgoing CV goes out on the ring. So in order to use both incoming and outgoing, you need to take that TRS cable and split it. Generally, the most common way would be a dual TS cable, and then your ring will go out, and your in, or your tip will go into the patch. And again, I have repeated this a billion times. It's in the damn manual. I see Mike now talking about it in the comments. Write it down. And you're going to hear me open a can of Coke Zero. Product placement. I told YouTube there wasn't going to be product placement in this video. Coke Zero. It's everything you need when you're doing a live stream about a modular synth in a box, except for like oxygen and power and attention span. And that is the interface modules. I'm going to go to the analysis modules next, just because they're quick and they're all related, and I can move through them pretty fast. So I mentioned at the very beginning of this that I have some audio coming in, and I deleted my expression pedal, didn't I? I don't know why I'm doing this other than out of habit. So I've got some audio coming in. How are my levels on that? Mike, can you hear it? Mike can jump in pretty quick.
Levels are good.
Okay. And this is not meant to be a masterpiece. I've got some other ones. That's the sound of all of them playing at once, which I'm sure you were waiting for. But now if I turn on my patch, I'll start to see that I have audio coming in that's not real loud, so it's not creating much of a difference. But you can see little squiggles there on the line. And we can go through the analysis modules and talk about what they do. Well, that's weird. What's going on with you, interface? Okay. So I've got this loop going, and what I've put here is the onset detector. And I'm going to adjust this again. And the onset detector only has one option, but it's a pretty important one, which is sensitivity. I initially didn't use this feature a lot, but I've been using it more recently. I thought it was not very receptive. And if you want something that you have even more control over, you could put a gate module between the audio input and the onset detector. But what an onset detector does is detect the onset or the transient, the beginning of a note. And so the sensitivity can help it distinguish between what's really a note and what's maybe some noise in the recording or something ringing out. And if we look at its output, see, this is where I'd probably turn down the sensitivity some, because I'm seeing it react to some lower grade noises in the loop. And you know, it's a balancing act. You can make it too insensitive and then it won't pick up on anything, but it's a really useful control. The other thing that I'll say is that I don't love the trigger outputs. If you see these, they're actually pretty slow in the grand scheme of milliseconds that ZOIA uses, and they can falsely re-trigger other things. So often when I'm using an onset detector, I'll take the output and use a comparator or an AHD envelope to clean that up into more of a square wave shape. So it's either, you know, on or off. So that's the onset detector. The next one is the envelope follower. And I'm going to leave these options alone for a second. We're just going to look at what it is first. So what the envelope follower does is turn the amplitude of what is coming in at the input. And I pointed out that I don't have a really high volume. On this loop, I could try turning that up because I have a gain control. I don't want to go too loud because of levels, but we can see it kind of increase here. And one thing to keep in mind about the envelope follower, so a lot of people who have used envelope followers or encountered envelope followers in the past think of them as like a wow sound on an envelope filter, like something that slowly opens and closes. But the envelope follower in ZOIA doesn't quite work like that to its benefit. What it does is directly translate amplitude into CV for use within ZOIA. So if we looked at like a drum hit, you know, with the guitar, we were seeing all sorts of squiggles because there's all sorts of squiggles at the top of a you know, guitar as the strings oscillate and whatnot. If we looked at a drum hit, it would look much more like a square wave, right? It would rise to a certain point and hold that. I'm thinking of like an electronic drum. And that's useful because there are occasions where you really want it to respond to just what's being played. But we can adjust the output of the envelope follower. We can add a rise fall time, which is sort of an internal slew limiter. You can also use an external slew limiter or a CV filter. I'll talk about those more when we get to them. You can also change its scale, but the module index suggests only doing that with internal sounds, and I'll point out maybe why. When we turn its output scale to linear, the output is really not very pronounced. Turn down the rise time. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a tiny little squiggle at the bottom every now and then. So the linear scaling, I'm not exactly sure what's happening with the linear scaling, but it tends to really quash the signal. So if you do want to use it, keep in mind you may want to do a lot of amplification, but even now, not very useful, I've found. And then the final analysis module is a pitch detector. See, I recorded something like where I just played a bunch of crazy notes all at once. And if we look at the output here, we see it sort of jumping all over the place. I also did something with chords. And we again see the output sort of moving around a lot. The pitch detector is monophonic, which means that it can't detect all the notes in a chord. And when it's just hearing one note, it'll do its best to keep up. It's pretty good at that. Every now and then it detects like an overtone or something that is part of the note, but not necessarily something you want to have it respond to. But it's pretty good at its job, which is turning the pitches that the tones that it receives at its input, at its audio input, into CV that is equivalent to the scaling used by the oscillators and other modules that use pitch within ZOIA. So that's the analysis modules. And again, there are a lot of other uses beyond these. You don't have to, a lot of people would use the pitch detector, for instance. I've used it a lot to create like guitar playable synths, but you could also use it, for instance, to adjust the speed of a tremolo as you played higher or lower notes, or the mix of a reverb or whatever. There are a lot of different ways these things can be used. There are a lot of different ways the envelope follower and the onset detector can be used. So that's our analysis modules. Before I jump into control modules, which is our next stop, maybe now is the time to pause, because I could use a little bit of a break and see if people have questions. And I could drink some more Coke Zero, the official Coke of me doing this live stream. Did anyone have any questions? Okay, well, I'm going to take a quick break here and talk generally about control modules. So control modules, if we think of the analysis modules as modules that turn audio into CV, we think of the interface modules as the modules that allow ZOIA to interact with the outside world. And control modules are a way of controlling what happens within ZOIA. They can both generate CV but they can also manipulate and change the CV produced by other things. So, for instance, I talked about the pitch detector. It produces pitches, but you could easily send it through a quantizer module, which will make sure that the output of those pitches fits along a specific scale or conforms to well-tuned chromatic notes. And so, the control modules both allow you to generate control and to manipulate the control generated by, or the voltage generated by other modules. I see we have a question. Yeah, I'm sorry, Jeff, but I'm not going to answer like a qualitative question. Like, that's really I don't fucking know. Like, I'm sorry to use profanity, but like, I don't know. Your ears may hear something different than mine. Like, I really don't care a whole lot for qualitative questions because, like, again, I like things that are different from other people. At the beginning, Mike and I were both talking about how much we hate mood, the Chase Bliss audio mood, and I don't want to really harp on this, but like, but we know lots and lots and lots and lots of people who love that pedal. So are we the outsiders who have it wrong, or are they? The answer is probably neither of us. It just has to do with how we use those things and what we're going for. So I haven't used Reactor in a couple years. I know Reactor can do a bunch of stuff ZOIA can't, but it's inside a computer that's, playing in a different ball field. But I don't know about quality. And there are ways to map connection strength, not to, well, that's a complex question that involves like patching, and this really maybe isn't the best place for it, Levi. I'm reading your question now. So you can map the feedback of a delay line. One of the resources I haven't talked about up until this point is like the tips and tricks document that I edit, but that's, I don't know why I didn't begin there. Like one way you could do that with something like not a pixel but a UI button is by using radio buttons. You could also use push buttons for that. I prefer UI buttons, as I've talked about, because you can use them both as a thing to interact with, and also it can give you feedback. There's some stuff in the tips and tricks about how to set up radio buttons in there. So you could set up a bunch of buttons that select between like 0% feedback, 25% feedback, 50% feedback, etc. Another example would be, so I made a light bright kind of essentially patch that I put out a couple weeks ago. And in that, the way that it works is by pressing down on a UI button, it increases and changes the color of the UI button as the value that's output increases. And I sketched out the schematic for how I did that in the patch notes for that patch. But you could also use a very similar method to control, like other things other than just the color of a UI button that you're pressing with that method. You could have something where the longer you press down on something, the more intense it was. Yeah, again, that's like a qualitative one, Jeff. Okay. So I'm going to start jumping back into control modules. And there may be a couple of points where I go out of order with these because they make more sense for me to discuss certain things in conjunction with other things. The LFO, I'm not going to talk too much about what an LFO is. I assume everyone has a pretty basic idea. It's a low frequency oscillator. And so, you know, it's basically moving anything that moves back and forth in CV values, like, and you've heard them like all your life. You know, I mean, if you've ever heard, and I understand these sound different in different countries, like any sort of emergency services siren, you know, that's the sound of an LFO as it changes pitch, right? You can hear it move from one pitch to another, from one volume to another. So, you know, I mean, we have different shapes here. And the one thing that I'll say is less about the shapes. I'm not going to go through all of them. You know, if you're not sure what a square wave is, you know, place it on the grid and look at the output. Again, use the shift plus eyeball, inspect, view. I don't, again, recall what that is in the manual, and look at what it does. But the one thing that I'll say is that even though there are a limited number of LFO shapes, there are a lot of different ways to manipulate the LFO shapes with other other modules. So, you know, a lot of people say, well, ZOIA doesn't have like 58 different LFO shapes. It actually does. And so it's just not all of them are contained in the LFO module itself. They have to do with how you combine different sources and adjust them using other modifiers, other CV modifiers. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those because they're easy examples when I get to them. But I want to point out a few different aspects, and I have a long video about LFOs, but they have a lot of features that are pretty useful. The swing control in the square wave controls the pulse width of the square wave. So if we think of a square wave as having an on cycle and an off cycle, even though this one slants this way, it slants even if you're not looking at it through a wide angle lens. I drew that poorly. We can adjust how much of that is the on part and how much is the off part. But for all of the other waves, it controls something a little bit like the direction that they tilt, but then as it goes further, it introduces some weird and potentially useful asymmetries. So, you know, I mean, that's a place to look for if you're looking for a unique or different source of modulation, is the swing control, particularly in something like a triangle wave. At the extremes, it takes on some very peculiar shapes. You can control the range from a positive range to a positive and negative range. You'll sometimes see this referred to as unipolar and bipolar in some literature about modular and that sort of thing. There's a phase input, so you can have LFOs that are out of phase with one another. So like quadrature LFOs, I'm not going to draw all 4 LFOs, but you could have like a sine wave that goes like this, and then it could have a buddy that goes like this. So when one sort of starts dipping, the other one starts rising, and on and on and on. and you can reset those with an input. A thing to keep in mind about that I'm hoping to see maybe corrected in the future is that the phase reset really only works when the LFOs are controlled by CV. When they're controlled by what is called tap. Tap is a general term that you'll see that can mean anything from MIDI clock to, the output of a sequencer or whatever. Any sort of regular beat. That's what tap is in this sense. It's not always tapping on a stomp switch is what I'm trying to point out. It could be another LFO that sets the rate of subsequent LFOs. When it's set by tap, when you reset the phase, it will initially reset to the new position, and then when the next tap comes in, it'll reset to the phase that it was in before, which I find a little irritating, and I hope will change. The sequencer is a big module. There are a lot of different ways to use it. There are some videos already out about using the sequencer in some interesting ways. Hakan has some videos about this. And, I'll point out a couple of quick things about it. So one thing to keep in mind is that it can be set to one shot, which can be really useful in certain circumstances. And I think people maybe don't exploit this as much as they would if they, were really like, oh, I want to do this thing only every now and then. That's what a one-shot sequencer can be good for. There's a restart jack, which allows you to reset the sequencer, and it'll reset on the next gate that it receives. So keep that in mind. And I'm just going to go to one other aspect of the sequencer. So I just have a one-step sequencer here. It's very exciting. So a lot of people ask, if I add tracks to this, no. If I add tracks to this, if I put on 3 tracks and look at the outputs, the first track is CV. The next track is also CV, which I wasn't expecting. And the third track is CV. Normally, I must have done something weird. Maybe when I switched it from loop to play once. Normally, when you start adding tracks, they come out in a sequential order, which is the first one would be CV, the next one would be gate, and the one after that would be ratchets. And here we can actually switch those. So if you press on the encoder, you could have, 8 tracks. The sequencer is limited to 8 tracks, so you could have more sequencers with more tracks, but on one sequencer you could have eight tracks of ratchets if you wanted, or gates, or CV. It's really just what you want to set it to, but not everyone realizes you can press the encoder and change the output type, and that'll change the input type. If I switch this to ratchets, I won't see A0 for step 1. I'll see 0, and I can start adding more ratchets. And just a quick rundown: CV is CV. Gates are on-off signals, so they go high and then they go low. And ratchets are divisions of a gate, essentially. So like trills and drum rolls and that sort of thing. And there are other ways to use them too. And one last thing about the sequencer is that the first track of a sequencer, but not any of the other tracks, can be used as a CV destination. So like the keyboard module, you could connect a bunch of different LFO shapes to the sequencer and cycle through them by sending a gate signal or you could have, you could use the sequencer itself as sort of a switch for other sequencers and have their outputs going into the first track and switch between different sequences, so it would sequence the sequences. There are a lot of different ways to self-patch and patch between a number of sequencers because of that fact. So that's something to keep in mind. The ZOIA sequencer at first seems pretty limited, and in some ways it definitely is, but because it exists in this pretty open-ended modular environment, and because it can do things that not necessarily other sequencers even within a modular environment can do, there aren't a lot of sequencers that can act as CV destinations. You'd use a sequential switch for that, maybe is what they're called in modular, but it can do things that other sequencers can't do. So it's a trade-off there, right? If you patch it, you can get all sorts of complexity out of the sequencer, but it doesn't natively sequence on its own. So let's see. Already starting to wear down a little bit. I was overly ambitious with this whole project. I'm going to try as much as I can to get through the control modules, but we'll see how it goes. ADSRs are envelope shapes, right? In general, ADSR stands for attack, you have a decay, sustain, and release, and these are timed events. This would be an amplitude amount, and this would be another timed event. You have a lot of options in how the ADSRs can be set up in ZOIA. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I am going to talk about a couple of things that are useful and maybe, not immediately picked up on. One is this feature called immediate release. And actually, I think I'll just... So if I'm going to put in a Stompswitch here and control this ADSR with the Stompswitch. When the ADSR is set to immediate release, if I press the Stompswitch, it'll hold at that sustain stage until I release. If I change that to immediate release off, essentially the difference becomes that it is now a triggered envelope. So it won't depend on how long I press this to see how long it stays open. This is something that needs to be worked on with the sustain stage, because it becomes like a weird sustain time stage at the same time. But the output of the ADSR well, it shouldn't. That's behaving oddly. Maybe we change that. Or maybe I just don't know how it works. Well, if you want a triggered envelope without a sustain stage, I know you would use the immediate release off. The ADSR is really a module that could use some cleaning up, because there are a lot of options and they're not all super intuitive. Even, it seems, to someone who's used one quite a bit. The other option that I wanted to point out is that you can change the time scale to linear. And what this means is not that the different stages have a different curve or slope. It means how you control them is determined by a linear CV value as opposed to an exponential one. And this is really useful because you could set, you know, an ADSR to oscillate between an attack that is half as long or twice as long or something like that, because those would all be divisions of a specific attack time. And ADSRs, beyond being used in the traditional sense of like a synth voice where you'd have an attack, decay, sustain, release stage for like the filter where it would go, well, my mouth's not going to do particularly well with this one, where we get louder and then it would drop to a certain level and then it would get quieter again as you released. Instead of having that, you could use these as all sorts of timed features. There's an input or a delay that you can add to the beginning, so it could be used as something where, like, if you play a note and you want something to swell in after 5 seconds, you could use an ADSR in that way, right? It doesn't just have to be used in the way of controlling the contour of, you know, something like a filter or a VCA. It can also be used for all sorts of useful, like, timing things. I'm going to move on, though, because there are a lot of features, and apparently I still need to do more research on the ADSR anyhow. So the sample and hold is something that confuses a lot of people. I'm going to show it off in a really traditional sense, which is if we go down and we add, I'll just kill 2 birds with 1 stone. If we add a random module and we put it in the input, and we still have this Stompswitch. So the random module, there's a feature of the random module that I'll show off in a second. The random module is essentially digital noise, right? It creates all sorts of, you know, CV values really quickly. And we can use a sample and hold. This is a very classic way of using the sample and hold. So we have the random module going into the input of the sample and hold. Nothing comes out the output, because a sample and hold is basically waiting for a command to sample, right? And when it samples, it just takes a snippet of whatever is at the input and holds on to it until it gets another command. So if I connect our Stompswitch here and press the Stompswitch, it'll sample from those random values. If I press the Stompswitch again, it'll sample again. This is a classic, you know, if you've ever heard like a 1950s sci-fi movie soundtrack, like the aliens or the robots are always, and the way that that's generated is with a sample and hold into an oscillator or a ring modulator or something like that, and you just get sort of like spacey tones, right, when you do that. Now the random module in ZOIA is actually built so you don't have to do that. You can use a new value on trigger input, and then it'll behave sort of like its own sample and hold. This is me killing those 2 birds at once. So you don't have to use a sample and hold to get that result from a random module. But I just wanted to use that example because it's a classic one that I think illustrates what the sample and hold will do. And even now, we've deleted the module that was going into the sample and hold, and it'll hold on to that output until, you know, something, until it's triggered again, and I'll trigger it again, and it'll drop to 0 because there's not anything at the input anymore. And you can use a lot of different things to trigger it. Like I was using a Stompswitch there, but you could use an LFO. I'm going to do that real quickly right now. For something more regular, So I've got a square wave LFO. I'm going to put another LFO into the input. I'm going to slow it down some. And if we look at the output, right, it's going to keep grabbing different sections of that LFO. And if we speed this up, it'll grab them more and more quickly. So you can use all sorts of different sources. Another thing that it's useful for, if we go back to our Stompswitch, is as a sort of delayed trigger. So I have this Stompswitch again. I'm going to slow this down once more. We've got this LFO going in, but it could be like a MIDI clock. It could be all sorts of things. And notice if we want to have something happen only on the beat, right? If this is our clock, and I can press this switch, and the sample and hold won't go high until it's received a clock signal. So it's really useful in that regard. It can be used for a bunch of other tasks too. I'm not going to get too deep into those because the sample and hold really deserves its own video. CV invert, CV rectify, and value are all somewhat related. The one thing that I'll show is that the value module can be set to a -1 to 1 range, and also as you press the encoder, it will display different values. So it can be set to show different note values, which can be great if you're trying to transpose remotely. It can also show frequency values. So that's useful for working with like a filter or something like that. You can use filter frequencies. These are also the frequencies for notes, but I don't know my note frequencies very well. Some people do, though. I know that A4 is 440 hertz, except for to the people who think that it's something else. There we go. We'll piss everyone off, Mike. I'll get into an A4 argument. Mood and A4. But it can also be set to show values. And the way that I want to explain these, because they are kind of related, sorry. The value module, an analog in the modular world would be something called like a precision adder. It's a way of creating offsets, right? You can add values to something, you know, if you've got an LFO that's going from, you know, 0 to 1, you can add a value to it and it'll go from, you know, 0.4 and get clipped at 1, but you could attenuate that. It could also, if you have an LFO going from 0 to 1 and you had a value module that was putting out -1 and you connected that to the destination of the LFO, then the LFO would be transposed down, so it would go from -1 to 0 instead of 0 to 1, because those two values would be added together. So when it was at 0, it would be added to -1, and when it rose to 1, the -1 and 0 would cancel out. I've got another phone call, but I want to explain all three of these modules with just one sorry, there's spam risk. And again, I apologize. I can't mute my phone right now because I've got uh, something going on. Now, this is going to look weird in the wide angle lens, but if we have this line represent 0 and we have a value module that goes from -1 or from 1 to -1, right? We have 1 up here and -1 down here. Just going to demonstrate what would happen if you took that value module. Sorry, you can't see it. I wrote 1 over here. Just take my word for it, and then I'm going to move this back into place and hide the 1. If you took that value module and you put it into a CV invert, the CV invert essentially takes this value and multiplies it by -1. So when it's at 1, it flips it over to -1, and when it moves into the positive, or when the value module would move into the negative realm, the CV invert's output would move into the positive realm, because -1 times -1 is 1, right? The signs cancel one another out. So a CV invert will multiply by -1, right? It multiplies whatever you put into it by -1. And the CV rectify basically will multiply anything that's negative by -1. So it would look like this, right? It would follow the number line until it reached 0 and then bounce back up. It won't generate any negative values. And I talked about, ways that you can combine modules to create different LFO shapes. A pretty easy one is by using a sine wave that's set to -1, -1 to 1 rather than 0 to 1, and then feeding it through a CV rectify. So we look at the output. Before we do that, we've got this sine wave, right? And it's going from 1 to -1. The CV rectify, though, is just like, fuck no, I'm not doing negative numbers, pardon my French. So it starts creating a humped, wave. You'll also notice that it is going at twice the frequency of the original sine wave, because it's taking all of these values below 0 and inverting them. So you can create humped or, spiked LFO shape. And you can also use the CV invert to invert values above in a realm from 0 to 1. This comes up a lot, so I'll just go through it. If you connect the output to a CV invert, right? So the CV invert is taking everything and multiplying it by -1. What we can then do is, again, the value module can be used to add or rescale things. So it's going to take this output and create a negative range. And if we add that to 1, what we get is something in the positive range. So these three modules can work together in all sorts of different ways to rescale, different CV sources, or to transpose things, to create new shapes. So there's a lot going on there. Trigger is pretty straightforward. If I had my trusty Stompswitch back, when it has a rising value at its input, a rising CV value at its input, it will produce a trigger. Let's look at that under the scope. Let's go to the film. And this looks like the output of our Onset detector. They produce very similar, if not identical, outputs. And again, I've already talked about it. I don't really like the output of a trigger module. So where I would use a trigger module, I'm more likely to use something, again, like a comparator or an ADSR, because I want something that responds quicker and more precisely than this. I know it doesn't look like much, but it actually like takes, I don't know, like 30 milliseconds or something like that for the trigger to fully close. And that's an eternity when you're, for instance, like moving between channels or something like that, and you want to have a clean signal when you do. So if you're getting results from the trigger module that you don't particularly like, try using a very short AHD envelope or maybe a comparator. And I'm pretty worn out at this point. I can keep going, but it won't be pretty. So again, my eyes were bigger than my plate at this point. I think I can do some questions right now. If people have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them, and I can get into some more depth about things that I was trying to, move quickly through. But as I said, and everyone was like, "Oh, you'll never be able to pull that off. That's way too much crap." And I said, "No, it'll be fine." I was lying. Because once you get into hour 2, things start looking a lot different. I'll supplement this further. It might not be as a live stream, which may be to everyone's benefit. So I kind of get nervous doing these things. I get nervous doing most anything, but I get more nervous doing these things. Were there questions? I haven't been paying attention to the chat at all. Mike, were there questions that going back at all on anything?
There were some about CPU and input pads, but I think I answered them.
Okay. Well, I'll repeat something, even though we didn't get to them, that I repeat so much it became kind of lampooned, but it's true. Mike repeats it some, and other people do too. If you run into a problem with control voltage, the chances are pretty good that your answer is going to be one of a multiplier, a switch, a comparator. What's the other one? I forget at this point. I am pretty tired. Is it a sample and hold? I don't know. But there are modules, and the other thing that I'll mention is that I have longer videos in more depth on some of these modules. So, I have done pretty exhaustive couple of videos about the comparator, the multiplier. I haven't gotten to switches yet. I have a video about LFOs and value modules. I have a video about, if I zoomed really quickly over some of that inverting stuff, I have a video where I go into more depth about the CV invert and the CV rectify. So the other part of this isn't meant to cover like every possible scenario or even particularly in depth. It's really about repeating stuff that is pretty like surface level in a lot of ways, but just being able to hear it may help people put things together. Again, like I compared it to Ben Jordan's video, and that's another video that's worth checking out. You know, the videos that were released at the time of ZOIA's release last April were all pretty excellent. The people that they sent review copies out to, you know, took time to talk about process and to get into the weeds, but not too far into the weeds. I'm going to change this so you can see my beautiful face because I'm just talking at ZOIA right now. So, you know, they're and most of those are linked on the Empress Effects website. Oh, you got a question about dotted eighth. What is dotted eighth? It's you never remember these things. Is it 5/16? No. I'm really bad with these sorts of questions. I can tell you how to get the ratio you need, but I can never remember what a dotted eighth is. So dot, when you add a dot, it's like adding a half. Like, do you know how to get a dotted eighth? 3/16. You know, so yeah, I think it's 3/16. You're right, Levi. So that, you know, that's what you put in. The clock divider is really an interesting module because, you know, again, talking about like, you know, so there are two clock dividers now at this point. There's a substantial divide between the clock dividers before firmware 1.13 and the clock dividers after 1.13. And if you want to know some of the differences that appear in firmware 1.13, I also have a video where I go into some of them. 1.13 is probably the most significant firmware update we've had. You know, you could go back to 1.02. You know, a lot of things were changed in ways that may seem subtle, but they open up a lot of possibilities. So I did a video on that too. But the clock divider before 1.13 would only have a multiplicand or a dividend, so it could only do, you know, 2 times or 1/3 or whatever. And the clock divider after 1.13 added added those two things together, so you could set up all sorts of ratios, 2/3 or 7/19. And that again is I think speaks to the openness of ZOIA, because there are a lot of clock dividers. You know, if the model is the modular world, there are a lot of clock dividers that are really pretty limited to divisions, for instance, of you know, 2, right? So they might do like 3/4 or something like that, but they don't do 3/7. You know, so you can get into some really weird rhythmic areas with the clock dividers. Yeah. And they've been much improved, as I was telling someone on the Facebook group today. They used to be kind of crappy. Try them if you haven't in a while. And try firmware 1.13 because it fixes a bunch of problems. And Mike and I helped bug test some of that stuff. It's not perfect, but they're particularly on timing. There are a bunch of long-standing issues that I think it helps address. See, people trying clock dividers all over the place. One of the other interesting things you can do with the clock divider is you actually no longer need an input. You can set the clock divider by CV, and I really haven't explored that enough. But you could set a CV value, and I think the CV values, not positive, are based on the logarithmic values of the LFO module, not the linear ones, which would be maybe better. But I can't confirm that. It might be the linear ones. But you can set it so that it doesn't take any sort of clock input. It just uses a CV value. So if you're using a CV value that went to an LFO and another CV, you could send that same CV value to the clock divider and generate, use it as sort of square wave LFO, for instance, because that's what it does. It goes on and off, right? You could, set it as a square wave LFO that did some weird time signature in contrast to what you were doing. You could send it to a couple of clock dividers that did weird time signatures in contrast to what you were doing, and then combine them with a logic gate. And there's some, Hakan has a video on logic gates. There's also, I've a chart of them on the tips and tricks page. And logic gates are a lot of fun. I don't actually know how to use them, in the sense that, like, I don't sit down and think, I will make a patch that uses an XOR gate and a NAND gate and whatnot. They're useful to know because they come up, right? There are scenarios where you want something to happen and not something else, or you want something to happen when two things converge at the same time. And that's how I use them. I say, I have a scenario where I want to press a stomp switch, and when the sequencer reaches this note, something happens. But if it hasn't reached that note, nothing happens. Okay, well, seems we've settled most of the questions, so I'm going to wrap this up so people can do whatever. Again, I'll supplement this. I'll make a note. We got to trigger module. And it may end up being 2 installments, because my plan was to do, boy, looks ridiculous now, but to do, a brief rundown of the control stuff and a brief rundown of the audio modules, which is like another 40 modules. I don't know what the heck I was thinking. But those, those supplements may not be as a live stream, just because it makes scheduling more difficult, and I have to talk to Mike and figure out what works with my schedule and all of that. But we'll do another live stream in about a month. Again, I said that the idea behind these live streams was generally to be more patching oriented, and I expect us to get back on that path next month, hoping next month will not be in the year of 2020. I'm not, anyone else is waiting for this to not be that year anymore. So hopefully things will improve. And I've already talked to some other people and promised to do something on synthesis. So the next month, sometime in January, we'll have another live stream, and that'll do, something with synthesis. I particularly want to talk about some stuff that I brushed over pretty quickly in the interface modules, which is like how to patch up velocity and aftertouch and that sort of thing in both the traditional way, and there's some stuff on that in tips and tricks, but also in maybe some like more experimental ways. So yeah, we'll reconvene in like a month if you're up for it, and talk about some weird synth noises and that sort of thing. And in between now and then, I'll probably try and get 2 more videos out. One that finishes up the control modules, and then another one that briefly goes over the audio modules. And again, bare bones stuff, but you know, sometimes it helps to hear things just being said. So, all right, I'm out of here. Have a good night. Thank you for showing up. Mike, do you want to say anything? I can throw him up on the screen. You got any announcements? Mike's doing all sorts of stuff.
I'm working on version 1.1 of the librarian. I took a hiatus because I've been doing my actual job that I probably should do it. Yeah. But I've been working on the librarian, and we'll have a release hopefully by the end of the year, if not very early into 2021. And thanks for everyone who's used it so far. It's been great feedback from everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, John. I'll just, John Breton was a huge part of that. And everyone else, there have been other people who've contributed a lot, but I like pointing out John because John
did most of it. Yeah.
Yeah. John's a Superman. So, all right. We'll catch you guys in a month or so when we get our calendar straight. Bye.
Bye, everyone.